Hello again and welcome back to another video build. This time around we're taking a closer look at the whole process of painting this wonderful figurine, Captain America as Hydra Supreme Leader, and I really hope you enjoy. Now this is one huge resin print, and it might even be the best 3D model I've ever worked with. This model is actually portraying Captain America as Hydra's Supreme Leader, as seen in the comic book event Empire. It's the result of what took place at Pleasant Hill. Not my favorite crossover event, mostly because I don't like the idea of Cap as a bad guy, but still, stylistically, it's full of eye candy. And as not to make this video too long, we're going to be focusing on just the paint job. Links to all the stuff you need to know is in the description. I chose to start with the skin tones, and all depending on the impression or style you want to go with, the many approaches are widely different. I'm trying to go for a clean, light flesh tone, and hopefully with a bit of realistic feel to it. I begin by putting on a fully opaque paint coat, giving it an even coverage. Now looking at this first piece, I believe it's a bit too light, so I added some more reddish brown to warm up the color tone a bit. It looked a lot better. So I went on to the rest of the parts. From this point on, we're going to add a lot of translucent layers and other techniques. So it's a good idea to apply some varnish first, just to prevent the color from lifting or bleeding. Then we need to add some freckles and imperfections to the skin. You usually apply this by using an airbrush with a low pressure, but I feel that by using a stiff brush or a toothbrush, that it gives me better control and gives a good result. Finishing touches are easy to adjust with a small brush. It's important that the freckles and imperfections look right for the scale. So if you end up with some spots that are too big, you can carefully remove them by using some alcohol. Then it's time to add some translucent layers. I'll be going through a range of different colors. You may call them paint washes. It's basically heavily watered down paint, which I apply with a paintbrush. Then I remove most of it again, using a sponge or a wet towel. Making sure to leave some paint in the corners and crevices, especially the places where the fabric will overlap the skin, or where the two meets to be precise. I go through a variety of tones, yellow, red, blue, and brownish washes. But as I move into the darker tones, I only apply it where I want the shadows to go. This goes for the lighter washes as well, adjusting the high and low spots, mainly adding a lighter tone to the nose and the upper cheekbones, and darker under the eyes, nose, and under the lip. The teeth are white, of course. But you will be surprised at how much yellow and grey I put in the color. That's to make sure they don't stand out, like a middle-aged Hollywood star. The same goes for the eyes. It's actually a more of a grey color. As it all starts to build up, I can tell I've used too much reds in there. That can simply be adjusted by adding a blue wash. But for now, I'll leave it as is, because I'll need to see how it all works together when the rest is painted. So I'll be moving on to apply the base coat for the helmet and uniform. I gently mask off some of the details I don't want painted yet, and then it's just a matter of laying down the base coat. Now, the base coat is all about getting a good even coverage, and as you've probably heard many times before, start with a light dust coat, followed by a heavier wet coat. But seeing that it is a highly detailed figurine, I am more focused on getting good coverage on everything. So by having the actual piece in my hand, I can easily move it around and let the airbrush hit it from all sorts of angles, making sure I cover absolutely everything. Grabbing some metallic blue color, I gave both the helmets a light touch, just to set them apart from the rest of the costume, which obviously would be made in some kind of fabric. Once I peeled off the liquid masking, I could tell that the skin tone wasn't too dark after all, but it still had too much reds in it. I decided to leave it be for a while longer, and instead focused on the eyes. I've actually seen a lot of people on YouTube that paint figurines. They actually use water slide decals for the eyes. And then by painting over it and sort of layering it in, it ends up looking really good. So I went there. Or halfway, I guess. Because I used some of my really sharp color pencils, drew out a couple of eyeballs on paper, cut them out with my X-Acto knife, some light touches on the edges with a black filter pen, and voila! I had myself 2 sets of eyeballs. And then I sort of glued them in place using a small brush. I actually used some high glossy varnish as the glue. I love testing out new approaches to things, especially things that might have gotten you a bit set in your ways. I might even end up ordering some actual water slide decals for my next project. I think they ended up looking really good, and I'm sure with some more shadows and maybe some washes, they will end up looking even better. I did some more masking to prepare for the metallic parts. Unfortunately, the Tamiya chrome silver I planned to use was all dried up and totally unusable. So instead I had to use some of Alclad's dark chrome. Now, the Alclad lacquers, they don't cover as well as enamel paints, so I was forced to apply a black base coat first. Of course, it ended up looking really nice and shiny. But that wasn't the look I was going for. I'm told this gilding wax is basically the same as rub and buff, which I can't get a hold of. This stuff was dry brushed on the chrome parts using a small chip brush. I also used some black acrylic paint, which was also dry brushed on the same way. It gave the metal a much rougher and beat up look, which I feel would go over much better for the overall impression. I don't know if you're familiar with the spray booth I recently made. Well, this would be the tabletop version. It's just as easy to snap on and off, and it comes in really handy for smaller touch-ups with the airbrush. Before going into all the smaller painting details, I wanted to darken the suit a bit by adding some shadows. Only sticking with various shades of blue. Then I went over all the remaining parts, like the shield, the boots, all the different belts, buckles and pouches. Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of details on this piece. Everything was given a base color, or a base coat as I often say. This is followed up by painting in all the smaller details, with a range of paintbrushes and colors of course. So, with all that done, and before I forget it again, let's take a look at how the display base was painted. It's a two-part display base, and the top part of it is just as you can see on the front cover. There's also some barbed wire and other rubble in the picture. But for this video, we'll continue to concentrate on the paint job. I chose to go with some plain acrylic paints. We start off with a very light grey base color. That's followed by applying lots of different shades of grey, all the way to a complete pitch black. As you can probably see, the paint I use is heavily watered down, and the actual application doesn't need to be very accurate. But I do try to imagine a single spot where the light could be coming from, so as the placement of the light and shadows would make sense. Once all that's good and dry, I go on to apply even more shades of grey. But this time, it's in the form of dry brushing. I use a small flat paintbrush for this, mainly so that the details will look to be in the same scale as a figurine. I brush on a medium grey on the already dark grey surfaces, just as I'm using a lighter grey on the already medium dark surfaces. Basically, I'm always making sure to apply a lighter shade of grey to a darker background. And don't dry brush all the rocks from top to bottom, but always leave one of the sides almost open for brushstrokes. Not only does it make it non-uniformed, but it naturally becomes more exciting and even a bit realistic. That's really the only two simple techniques you need to get to this point. Now we could go on with adding all sorts of stuff. Maybe scratch build some broken wooden beams, make some barbed wire, some loose rocks and gravel, basically all sorts of things you can imagine. But if you've seen any of our videos before, you'll know we like the hero to shine the brightest. That means I want the display to look good, but it can't overshadow the actual figurine. That's why I went for that old, rusty and worn down steel fabric feeling for the bottom part. It starts by covering everything in a coat of black paint. Still using acrylic paints. For this I use a medium brown, bright yellow and a bright orange color. Then with a medium-sized paintbrush, I continuously sort of dab the color along the sides. I apply the paint pretty thick, in several layers in fact. This creates a wonderful texture, which is perfect for this look. And like my wife commented, it might look like I'm mindlessly throwing on the paint. I'm actually trying to get some concentrated highlights on there. So by building up from brown to orange to bright yellow, I can create some high spots where I would like them. And remember this, acrylics have a tendency to cure much darker than what you mix them. I believe it came out looking really good, and it seems grounded, so I do believe it will go well together with the figurine. And so we can return to all the resin eye candies. I love every step to a paint job like this, but from here on in, that might be my favorite part. I thought I might start with the boots and work my way upwards, and I thought instead of going through every single piece equally detailed, which would take too long, I would instead concentrate on one single part and take you through all the steps I apply. That means we'll be going from this to this. I'm starting with a thin black wash, but since everything has been given a coat of varnish, and you might have experienced this yourself, the paint won't stick all that well. So by using the thin black wash, I brush it on everywhere, going all around the piece. Then once it's wiped down again, it has left a few dirty cracks and corners, but also, the paint will go on beautifully again. The boots has several layers of fabric, so by using different color tones of dark brown, I try and separate the pieces by giving each a detailed separate color tone, always trying to imagine where the shadows would go. The high parts, or highlights, are enhanced by an orange wash. Then I move on to some dry brushing, and again, trying to give each piece a separate look. Let the brush enhance the 3D textures of the model. Imagine where the highlights would be, and where the boots would have the most wear and tear. Before I turn to the weathering part, I make sure to paint the bottom of the soles with a matte black. This way, when I apply the weathering, it can also cover some parts of the sole, making everything look separate, but still like one piece. All the way up until now, whenever I've said I've applied some washes, it's actually been plain acrylic paints diluted with some tap water. So this will be the first time I ever am using pre-made washes. I start by toning down everything with a mix of dark browns. It gives it both a darker and more warm appearance. And I gotta say, those washes are simply beautiful to work with. It's actually pretty much like adding a subtle color filter in Photoshop. Using a small round detail brush, I try to add some scratches, damage, and natural wear and tear. Then I apply some gunmetal to the buckles and buttons. You would think that that would be the last thing I did, but at this point, I actually don't know yet. That's because I like to do the finishing touches once everything is completely assembled. But for now, I think we'll call the boots completely done. Moving on with painting all the rest of the parts, I basically go about it by applying all the same steps. Maybe with a few minor adjustments here and there, and different colors of course. And make sure to take the time to test fit the pieces along the way, just to make sure they blend well together, and have the same overall look. It's actually amazing to see how much wonderful details you can get from some simple dry brushing. But this is only achieved when you have a model with this level of wonderful surface texture. Really taking the time to put in all those smaller, minute details makes all the difference in the end. Using all the same techniques as previously, then I finish it off with some silver gilt wax or rub and buff to highlight all the edges of the cast iron, making sure I don't go overboard, but just apply enough to make it believable. I think it's safe to say I've fallen in love with these washes. Like on this leather piece for instance. Having applied a lot of different painting techniques, the washes just brings it all together nicely. The Hydra symbol was carefully painted with some Tamiya gold enamel paint. And the green costume underneath, I was forced to tone it down pretty heavily, just to make it fit the overall look. Using some 2-part 5-minute epoxy, I glue some of the parts together as they get finished. And having put the torso in place, that would be the minute I got my geek out moment. It just looked so freaking good. And just to give you an idea of how much I love this stuff, I'm gonna share something with you. This is from way back in the early 90s, before Photoshop had layers and Silvestri could draw feet. It's some sketches I drew from back when I really wanted to become a comic book artist. So for me to end up with a hobby like this, probably inevitable I would guess. This is just to give you an idea of how much I've loved all the Marvel and DC comics over several decades. So being able to 3D print all those characters at home and then paint them, man, just loving it. Well, there's not many years ago I would call that science fiction actually. But enough of that, let's finish off the figurine. Sometimes you can save a lot of time by just painting by freehand, and not spending all that time masking your piece. It may take some practice, but in this case, having such easy clean lines, it's just a matter of a steady hand. It sure helps to have the piece in your other hand, so that you can move it about slightly. That makes it a lot easier getting those clean downwards strokes. If the viscosity of the paint is right, and you don't take too long between the brush strokes, then you end up with a flat, even surface. You could even say it looks like it was airbrushed on. Getting to the last piece of the project. I believe we've seen these heads on and off several times during this video. Because when I'm in the process of actually painting these, things usually take a lot longer time than what you see in the video. And after a while, you tend to go blind or stuck. So taking a natural break from it, while you might be working on something different, lets you get the opportunity to come back to it and look at it with fresh eyes. Then you might instantly see what needs to be improved, or just fine as it is. And so, having applied some weathering and the final touches to these pieces, I can safely say, and that was the last piece of work I did on this prop. So I guess that's it for this video. It sure was a long one, with lots of details, and even me babbling on about my old school drawings. But I guess that's why we include the stuff to the titles. Nonetheless, we hope you enjoyed it, and maybe you saw something you want to try yourself. Make sure you subscribe and hit that bell, and we'll try and share our next video build with you. Thank you for watching.